Hi, welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at reactions to laissez-faire capitalism. So if you remember in our last lesson, we were looking at the technologies and the corporate structures that evolved after the American Civil War between about 1865 and 1920. And today we're going to start looking at how the American people reacted to them, and specifically what would be considered the working classes, the underclass, people who were paid wages for their labor by the hour or the week. And as you can see in our image here, it certainly has a more socialist or Marxist bent, but it does illustrate a point of view in which there were more and more people who were seen to be working and struggling to make ends meet. And that was propping up a system where other classes of people made decisions but didn't have to physically experience that labor. And so we're going to look at the rise of unions in the United States, what worked, what didn't. It's important to note that unions won't really gain respect and legal protections until the middle of the American 20th century. So between about 1934 and the 1960s is the height of unions in the United States. But today we're going to be looking at the late 19th century and how those unions evolved, basically the experiments that take place in order to get what are the modern unions that exist today. So some vocabulary that is very helpful for us, especially when looking at texts during this time period. So I'm going to quickly go through these, but the first one is strike, and that is when organized labor decides to walk off the job for some period of time, and they do so to hopefully bring about better wages and working conditions. A strike sometimes comes when collective bargaining breaks down. So collective bargaining is when labor and management come together to try to work out a contract. Management wants to pay their workers, but obviously doesn't want to cut into their bottom line, right? Their profit margin. So they're constantly looking for ways in which they can keep their employees happy, but not necessarily give away too much of what they are amassing in terms of their bottom dollar. Collective bargaining usually is how the two sides hammer out a contract. And when that contract gets close to expiring, people return to the bargaining table. When an agreement can't be made and the contract has lapsed, sometimes that's when you get a strike or people literally walking off the job. In the first part to the middle part of the 20th century, unions were able to legally have what is called the closed shop, meaning that you had to belong to a union to be able to work in a particular factory or business. That closed shop will come about because if you have what we call commodity labor. An individual goes and says, I want better pay and better working conditions, but it's low skilled or no skilled work. He probably doesn't have much chance of improving his circumstance. But if he's one of, let's say, 2,000 workers on the factory floor any given day, and all 2,000 workers say, we want slightly better pay and slightly less work hours and maybe some better conditions, well, then they might do well. But you're only going to have that power if every single person working within that specific factory is actually part of the union. A lockout is a tactic that sometimes employers used and still use to this day. When you have labor threatening to strike, management might come in and actually lock labor from going to work and attempt to hire people, strike breakers, or what were sometimes called scabs. People who would come in, not necessarily to take on that work permanently, but at least long enough to encourage labor to either come back to the drawing board or simply accept the terms of management. An injunction is a legal term, and that is when a judge will step in and prevent somebody from taking some action. So there are times when judges have issued injunctions to prevent strikes. They've also issued injunctions to prevent lockouts, but whenever either side goes to a judge in order to prevent some action by the other party, that's an injunction. And then wages, that's what you're paid per hour, per week, for the labor that you do. So labor, it's going to change a little bit in this time period in that we're going to see this idea of commodity labor continue to grow. The supply of labor is growing in the United States exponentially every year because, for the most part, there was unfettered immigration. In 1882, there will be something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and there'll be some limits on Asiatic labor in the latter part of the 19th century. But for the most part, you are going to see in some years literally millions of people immigrate to the United States. Most factories in the Northeast through the Midwest were not diverse places. Typically, African Americans were kept out of factories. They won't begin to take on factory jobs en masse until 1915 and what begins the period of the Great Migration. You see that African Americans are typically confined to menial labor, cleaning, cooking, and certainly in the American South, a lot of farming as sharecroppers. There are some African Americans who will gain skills and education and become the middle class of their cohort, but that is a very limited number of people. And typically, if one became a teacher, a lawyer, or a doctor as an African American, that's who your clients and customers and patients were. You were not treating the larger white population. Women who were poor have always worked, and they will continue to do so through this time period. Work in factories, but also some women will essentially work out of their homes, doing a lot of the finishing work in the garment industry, which is the production of clothes. So whether that was some fine finishing in terms of embroidery, sewing buttons on blouses, things like that, that might be work that women were doing to be paid by the piece out of their home to further support and augment the family's income. And obviously children working is going to be a norm. About 10% of all employees, wage earning employees in this time period, are going to be people under the age of 14. And women certainly were hired because you could pay them less money. You could pay children less money. They also had smaller hands, smaller bodies. There were certain tasks within mining and the factory system that were best suited for them. And children will be utilized until the law prevents it in the 20th century. The Supreme Court will be the first of our three branches at the national level to actively begin to do some regulating of industry. So we talk about laissez-faire, to leave alone, at a time when we saw very little regulation of the economy by the government. And in the Wabash v. Illinois case, the Supreme Court was deciding two things. One, did customers have a right to know what were the rates that were charged by the railroad industry? And also, did railroad companies have the power to do pooling? Pooling is when you have people within the same industry, and they may not directly compete in the same market. They may actually control different markets, but they deliberately choose to charge the same amount of money for a service so that there is no competition. And railroad companies, which controlled much of the wealth and power in the United States in this period, pooled all the time. There were about a dozen railroad companies, and they deliberately made sure that they were charging the same rates, so you couldn't go to a cheaper railroad for transportation. Also, they charge different rates to different customers. If you were a large business and moved a great number of tonnage on the rails, you might pay a few cents per mile per ton. However, if you were a farmer who once or twice a year needed to utilize the rails in order to transport, your grain or your livestock, you might pay considerably more per mile per ton. That is seen as unfair. And so Wabash v. Illinois got rid of both those practices. And this decision has actually been used to make further decisions by the court based in other industries over time who attempted to not post rates or conduct pooling. The recommendation by the court was to create some type of bureaucracy that would essentially oversee these issues, that it essentially was unfair to the consumer to have to get to a place where they would seek redress from unfair and uncompetitive practices. And so that's how the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC, came to be. So the dynamic we're going to be looking at today is labor versus management. And by management, that could be whoever is your supervisor on the factory floor. It could be the person who is overseeing the entire facility. all the way to the CEO. We could also be speaking about the board of directors of a corporate organization. Labor are going to be people who earn wages, who work daily, weekly, in terms of their pay structure. And certainly in this time period, it's important to remember what we learned about in our last lesson. With the mechanization of labor, we see more and more de-skilling. And so labor is truly now a commodity. If I want to get better wages for myself, I'm not going to be able to do that as an individual because I don't demand a great deal of money because I'm not skilled. So I've got to combine with the interests of other people who are like myself in order to affect change. The Congress will actually begin to do, in theory, some regulation of monopolistic practices around 1890 with something called the Sherman Anti-trust Act. It's important to note that the Sherman Anti-trust Act was used to prosecute very few monopolists. What will actually be the legislation that will reshape the 20th and 21st century in terms of monopolistic practices is something called the Clayton Antitrust Act that's written in 1914. Also, the Sherman Anti-trust Act, when it was used between 1890 and 1940, it was typically used against the actual laborers themselves if they were unionized. And there's no mistake here. In order to get this legislation passed, there were plenty of people who felt monopolistic practices by corporations were problematic, but they also felt that unions were problematic. And so when we look at these two clauses, number 2, every person shall monopolize or attempt to monopolize, to combine or conspire with another person to monopolize any part of trade or commerce. Well, that's a description of what happens when labor comes together and forms a union. When that union goes on strike, they have a monopoly on labor, and they utilize it in order to affect a better outcome. And so the Sherman Anti-trust Act, unfortunately, did more to cause problems for unions than it necessarily did to solve the problem of monopolistic practice. So very briefly, when we speak about the history of unions, there's different type of union structures. The earliest unions in the United States, one of those groups was called the Molly Maguires, and they were essentially a secret fraternal organization of miners in Pennsylvania, all of Irish background. It was illegal for them to form a union. They all worked in the coal mining industry. And as you can see from our picture here on the right, that was very challenging work. If you managed to survive, 20 or 30 years in the mines from not being crushed, not, being caught in a fire or poisoned by, a methane gas leak, you probably succumb to something like black lung cancer of the lungs by the time you were in your early 40s. But it was ultimately the only employer in places like southern Pennsylvania, western West Virginia. So the Molly Maguires realized that for the mining companies that they worked for, that there were things that perhaps they might be able to do en masse that they couldn't do as individuals. Their big concern with the mining industry was the vast majority of mining companies also owned what was called a company town. So if you worked for the mines, you also rented housing from the company. Your groceries and sundries that you bought at the local store were also owned by the company. Also, many of these mining companies paid their employees in scrip, which essentially was coupons that could only be used in the company stores, in the company town for housing. And so you had little to no cash that you could use elsewhere. And typically the companies charge much higher than average rates for housing and food. And so the Molly Maguires did walkouts. They also sabotaged equipment. They would deliberately disassemble elevators and other tools that might be needed to operate the mine in order to stop work for a day or two. And in doing so, it makes the company realize the value of their workers. However, this also creates the issue that if you are damaging property, that you are also potentially harming other workers. And you are ultimately stealing from the company because they can't operate because of your behavior. The Molly Maguires also sabotaged certain mine openings by utilizing things like dynamite. And in the end, a good number of their leaders were arrested and criminally prosecuted. But it showed that working together as a group could have a great effect. And that is what's going to inspire the activities of the group called the Knights of Labor. And the Knights of Labor are an all who toil union. And that means any person who works for a wage can belong. Your gender, ethnicity, skin color, it doesn't matter. And the idea was that if you could get enough workers, let's say 10, 20, 30% of the American population of workers to agree to this, you could have large-scale strikes. And certainly we will see a few of those in American history. They are far more common in Europe, where unions sometimes function as all who toil entities a little more commonly than they do in the United States. For about 15 years, however, the Knights of Labor were able to organize a good percentage of the American workforce. In 1877, a group of railroad workers in West Virginia went on strike. They were told that they were going to have their wages cut by a third, and they were actually all working for the Vanderbilt family's company. And two groups, the brakemen, those are the people who are literally responsible for slowing and stopping these locomotives, and the firemen, who were the people who fed those boilers so the locomotive could move, they were seen as sort of the most important of those workers, and so they decided to strike first. And very quickly, other people who worked for other railroads decided to go on strike as well, whether or not they were facing any kind of reduction in wages. And by the end of the first week in July of 1877, railroad travel for goods and people had basically ground to a halt. And Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the president at the time, used the United States military to start operating trains, and in some cases encourage striking workers to get back to work. But it showed that if you were organized, you could do some powerful things. Work stoppage, especially in railroads, was a real big issue in the United States. The vast majority of people's food, coal, and other materials were being literally transported into America's ever-growing urban centers. If you could cut off that transportation by having the workforce walk out, you could make demonstrative change. And in the case of Vanderbilt's workers, they did get better pay as a result of what they did. The Knights of Labor will be challenged through the events of something called the Haymarket Square riot. So in Chicago in 1886, the McCormick Harvester Company again said they were going to reduce wages to their workers on a Friday, saying that when you return on Monday, you will be making less money. And it's important to note that for many of these unions, what would happen to them is not that they were negotiating for better pay or better conditions, but that management would simply come in one day and say, we're going to pay you less, 10%, maybe 30%. And that would utterly destroy some families. So in 1886, when the McCormick Harvesters workers found that they were going to have less money over the next weeks and months, they decided to use that weekend to protest in an area called Haymarket Square, which was adjacent to where the factory was. And there were lots of other unionized people belonging to the Knights of Labor in and around the Chicago area. And on May Day of 1886, nearly 10,000 people gathered to protest. And over the next couple of days, what had started as a protest by a small group of workers ended up taking over much of the city. And unfortunately, a bomb went off. People were killed, almost 100 people by the time the National Guard came to settle matters. And it really did focus on the issue of what was seen as anarchy and anarchist behavior. And it was attributed to the unions. And so the Knights of Labor, unfortunately, dwindled very quickly after that point, because at least in the popular press and certainly by elected officials, they were seen as instigators of violence and ultimately a threat to peace in America. So what replaces them? Well, it's a group called the American Federation of Labor. A man named Samuel Gompers, our gentleman here in the center of this picture, he was a cigar maker, which actually is a skilled profession. And his concern always with things like the Knights of Labor was that regardless of whether you were skilled or unskilled, you belonged to a union. And he said the reality is it's a capitalist system, and that if you are highly skilled, some of these, especially factory jobs, well, you should make more money. He also had some concerns that, in a sense, you can't fight for everybody. And his goal was to see that white males who were part of the laboring classes, especially if they were skilled, they would earn enough money to be essentially very well off working class or maybe even a middle class person. And the AFL by the 1930s is able to achieve this. If you worked on the line at Ford, GM, you would be making a middle class wage or better. And their argument was that whether you went to college and moved into management, or you spent 3 to 5 years of your life working in something that was highly skilled, like being a pipe fitter, a plumber, a furnace operator at a steel mill, you deserved a wage commensurate with those skills and knowledge. The AFL divided itself up into shops. So if we take the example of the steel mills of the day, if you worked as someone who operated a furnace, well, as an amalgamated steel worker, you had a set of skills that not everybody else in the factory, they had other jobs. They didn't have those skills and perhaps should not command such a high wage. So what happens when your small little union decides to go on strike or decides to try to collectively bargain for better wages and conditions? Well, there's always the threat that management will simply replace you. So the genius of the AFL was that in every steel mill, every group that could consider themselves amalgamated steel workers, they would have their own shop. And that way, you essentially couldn't replace a set of striking workers, because all of the people who had those commensurate skills and knowledge wouldn't cross the picket line. They wouldn't be scabs or strike breakers against their brothers in the union elsewhere. The AFL will be successful in achieving many of their goals. And part of it is because, at least until the 1930s, they chose to be an apolitical organization. They're not so in the rest of the 20th and the 21st century. But in the first 50 years of their inception, they really focused on the idea of making sure that white males had middle-class pay for the skills that they possessed. And they were able to really change how unions were perceived and help people who had tried to unionize for better conditions and better wages to be successful. Their first showdown with management will come in 1892 at the Homestead strike. And the Homestead steel plant had actually been owned by one of Andrew Carnegie's competitors. And Carnegie had purchased it in the late 1880s. And it operated a little bit differently than many of his other steel mills in that it had a company town. It was also one that of the largest. It had nearly 12,000 employees. And the day-to-day operations by 1892 actually weren't even done by Andrew Carnegie. He had his business partner, Henry Clay Frick, operate that particular mill, although he was knowledgeable of the goings on at the mill. But the amalgamated steelworkers decided that they had managed every couple of years to have a contract that got them better pay. And in 1892, they sought more money, and they were going to get that by threatening to go on strike. And Henry Clay Frick said, not only are you not going to get more pay, but we're going to cut your wages by 10%. And so in doing so, he was able to effectively create a circumstance in which not only did the Amalgamated Steelworkers walk out, but all the other sub-unions within the plant. And when it was all said and done, 12,000 people walked off the job, and production of steel ground to a halt. In order to try to force these striking workers back and to get the plant up and running, because they were not going to be able to hire enough strike breakers and scabs to bring the plant up to speed, he also went and hired Pinkerton's agents. And back in the late 1800s, you could go to the Pinkerton agency and hire everything from a detective to an armed mercenary. Henry Clay Frick hired 300 of them and tried to secretly bring them into the factory. And unfortunately for him, most of the workers were armed or at least ready to fight. And in doing so, bloodshed occurred. And one of the things that very quickly resolved itself was that we see the Homestead strike tarnished Andrew Carnegie's reputation. Even though he wasn't on site, the actions of Henry Clay Frick and his knowledge of them certainly made people question, although he'd begun this process of philanthropy, how much did he really care for the average American worker? To contrast the kind of work that the AFL was attempting to do, which ultimately is to be organized by skill, the American Railway Union took a different approach. Their approach was one in which they were trying to organize within a whole industry. And this will be expanded upon by a man named Eugene Debs, who at one time had worked for the railways, but moved on into being the leadership for their union. And he believed that you could take what was the largest workforce in the United States, about a third of people who were working for wages were directly connected to the railroad industry. Whether you were a conductor, a brakeman, a fireman, a porter, a stevedore, you each played an important role. And his argument was that at some point, management somewhere would overstep, and they needed to be prepared when necessary to strike for one another. And that came about in 1893 with the Pullman strike. George Pullman owned a company that made luxury train cars intended for long distance travel. So prior to the early 1880s, when you traveled New York to Chicago, you brought your own food, you sat in a seat for the entire journey, which might take a day and a half, 2 days. Every so often the train would stop and you would get off to, handle your bathroom needs, but it was in no way comfortable or luxurious. So Pullman decided that he was going to essentially create a hotel on wheels. And these palace cars had beds, they had bathroom facilities. For first class passengers, they had 5-star dining and restaurants. And it was an incredibly successful business. However, in 1893, there was a panic. And Pullman believed that in order to meet his fiduciary responsibility to his stockholders, he was going to have to reduce wages. He, like many of the coal miners of the day, he believed that his workers were going to be best served if they lived in the company town. And actually, his company town, for some people, they greatly admired it. It seemed like a place that was pretty comfortable, clean, but he, like many of the business people of his day, paid his workers in scrip. He also paid them in cash. And when it came to trying to do some cost cutting, he reduced their wages by a third, most of that being their cash payout. And on top of that, he did not reduce their cost of living. Their rent, the prices for their groceries stayed the same. And so, although the Pullman workers, which literally were carpenters, they were people who built these carriages, were not directly operating on the railway, the ARU believed that they were their brothers in the industry. And Debs asked all members of the American Railway Union to join in a strike. And it went on for months, and it was incredibly successful if one is thinking about the power of labor when it does strike. It was unsuccessful in the sense that Pullman's workers, for the most part, were replaced. Their wages did not return to their pre-panic level. And Eugene Debs ended up going to federal prison for 4 years. He even took his case to the Supreme Court, hoping that he would gain his freedom. But the court decided that, in actual fact, Eugene Debs had actually incited insurrection. By stopping railway traffic for weeks and weeks on end, he was stopping the movement of food and resources like coal. And much like the Great Train Strike of 1877, he was stopping the transportation of the U.S. mail. And President Cleveland used the U.S. military to step in and break the strike. Debs will go on after 4 years of prison. He'll spend a lot of time reading Karl Marx and Joseph Engels, and will convert fully to communism and begin his own all-who-toil union called the International Workers of the World in 1905. They will have some success in terms of attracting membership, but things like the Russian Revolution of 1917 will certainly make the American public very suspect of them. And they will not ever gain the kind of influence that a group like the AFL will. In this time period, we'll also see women beginning to organize, particularly in the garment industry. That's where the vast majority of women who worked in factories, it was the kind of work they did, sewing of shirts and clothing, shoes, and other items. And the Women's Trade Union League will create lots of unions that are focused on particularly that industry and better conditions for women who work in factories. As we close out, I just want to leave you with an image that I think is important for you to understand. As we go through this time period, we're going to look at more and more political cartoons. And it's to get a better sense of artist's point of view. How do we identify, how does the artist feel about its subject? So first we have to identify that subject. And my suggestion always is to look at the elements. What do we see? Do we see any particular figures? And in this case, we actually see some proper nouns. We see Vanderbilt and Gold and Field. Some of the wealthiest men of the Second Industrial Revolution. And our artist has made their bodies money bags. And so that's an old expression. Someone who has a lot of money is a money bag. But they're sitting nice and comfortable and dry on this giant raft that seems to be floating in this ocean. And it's being held up by literally workers. And our artist has drawn them as people who kind of accept their fate, but show great physical strength. They're not demonstrating much resistance. But literally, what keeps the economy afloat? It's the working classes, according to our author.